man and a slave in a system that feared him. The most famous escape from American slavery is often remembered through disguise, deception, and the courage of a woman who walked through the South as a white man. But hidden behind that story is another truth, one that is equally dangerous, equally intelligent, and equally essential. That truth belongs to William Craft, an enslaved man who understood something terrifyingly clear about slavery. The system feared enslaved black men not because they were weak, but because they were capable. William Craft's life reveals a side of slavery that is often misunderstood. Slavery was not only about forced labor. It was about controlling black masculinity, suppressing independence, and preventing enslaved men from becoming husbands, fathers, and decision-makers. William's resistance did not begin with escape. It began with observation, restraint, and a deep understanding of how power worked in the world that claimed ownership over him. William Craft was born in 1824 in Millen, Georgia, into a society structured to deny enslaved men authority over their own lives. From childhood, William was taught that his body belonged to others, his labor was not his own, and his future could be altered or destroyed at any moment. Unlike enslaved women, whose oppression was often sexualized, enslaved men faced a different but equally brutal form of control. They were viewed simultaneously as property and as potential threats. Their strength was exploited, but their independence was feared. As William grew older, he was trained as a cabinet maker, a skilled trade that placed him in a unique position within the enslaved system. Skilled enslaved men occupied an uneasy space. They were valuable, mobile, and exposed to broader social environments, yet they remained legally powerless. William's trade allowed him to move through towns, interact with white customers, and observe the workings of Southern society more closely than many field laborers could. This exposure sharpened William's awareness. He saw how white men spoke freely, negotiated wages, traveled without permission, and controlled their households. At the same time, he saw how enslaved men were denied these same privileges regardless of skill or intelligence. The contrast was not subtle. It was enforced daily through law, violence, and humiliation. One of the most painful realities William faced was the instability of enslaved family life. Enslaved men were routinely denied the role of protector or provider. Marriages had no legal standing. Children could be sold away without warning. William understood that no matter how skilled or obedient he was, his relationships could be erased instantly by a financial decision made by someone else. This fear became real when William married Ellen, an enslaved woman whose light skin made her particularly vulnerable to exploitation and transfer. Their marriage existed only by permission of their enslavers, and that permission could be withdrawn at any moment. William lived with the constant knowledge that his wife could be sold, abused, or separated from him permanently. Slavery demanded that enslaved men accept his powerlessness. William refused to accept it internally, even if he was forced to perform obedience externally. His resistance was not loud or impulsive, it was strategic. He watched, listened, and learned. He understood that open rebellion often led to brutal punishment or death. Survival required patience and calculation. William also understood something else. Slavery depended on performance. It required enslaved people to act submissive and white people to act authoritative. These roles were repeated so often that they became unquestioned truths. William began to recognize that if these roles could be imitated convincingly, they could also be exploited. This realization became the foundation of the escape plan he would later develop with Ellen. While Ellen's disguise would challenge racial and gender assumptions, William's role would be equally dangerous. He would have to perform submission perfectly, even while knowing that the success of the escape depended on his intelligence and discipline. Any sign of equality or familiarity could expose them both. William's masculinity was not erased by slavery, it was constrained. His role as a husband existed in defiance of a system that denied enslaved men the right to protect their families. The decision to escape was not simply about personal freedom. It was about reclaiming the right to be a man on his own terms, to make decisions, to protect his wife, and to shape his future. As William and Ellen began discussing escape, William approached the problem as a craftsman approaches a complex project. He analyzed risks, identified weaknesses, and planned carefully. He understood that the South was saturated with surveillance and that typical escape routes were heavily monitored. Any plan relying on secrecy alone was likely to fail. What made William's thinking radical was his willingness to trust intelligence over force. He did not believe freedom could be seized through strength alone. It had to be engineered. His role would be to support Ellen's disguise by reinforcing the expectations of slave society itself. He would become invisible in plain sight, a servant so convincing that no one would question his presence. William Craft's story is often overshadowed by the drama of Ellen's transformation, but without William's discipline, restraint, and strategic thinking, the escape would not have succeeded. His life forces us to reconsider how resistance works and who is remembered as its architect. William was not simply following Ellen, he was navigating a system designed to break enslaved men psychologically and physically. His success lay in refusing to let that system define his capacity for thought, planning, and leadership. By the time William and Ellen committed to escape, William understood the stakes fully. Capture would mean punishment, separation, or sale deeper into the South. Yet remaining enslaved meant a slow erasure of everything he valued. The risk of escape was terrifying, but the cost of staying was unbearable. Their journey would soon test every assumption slavery depended on. And at its center stood William Craft, a man whose quiet intelligence made one of history's most daring escapes possible. Maria Jean, masculinity, and the decision that changed everything. Marriage under slavery was not a sanctuary, it was a vulnerability. For William Craft, marriage did not provide security or stability. Instead, it sharpened his awareness of everything slavery threatened to destroy. His relationship with Ellen existed entirely at the mercy of other people's decisions. They could be separated at any moment, not because of wrongdoing, but because slavery treated human relationships as disposable. William understood that enslaved men were denied one of the most basic markers of manhood, recognized in 19th century society, the ability to protect and provide for one's family. White men defined masculinity through authority, independence, and legal control over households. Enslaved men, regardless of strength or skill, were denied these roles by design. This denial was not accidental. It was a deliberate strategy meant to weaken resistance by breaking familial bonds and eroding self-determination. William's skilled labor as a cabinet maker gave him limited privileges, but it did not shield him from this reality. He could earn money for his enslaver, build fine furniture for white households, and move through town on work assignments, yet none of these activities granted him control over his own life. His labor benefited others. His intelligence was tolerated only so long as it did not challenge authority. The fear that haunted William most was the possibility of children. Under slavery, children inherited enslaved status through their mother. William knew that fatherhood would mean watching his own children become property, subject to sale, punishment, or abuse. This was not an abstract fear. He had seen families torn apart repeatedly. He'd seen men powerless to intervene as their children were taken away. Slavery turned love itself into a liability. These fears transformed William's understanding of escape. Freedom was no longer just a personal desire, it became a moral necessity. Remaining enslaved meant participating, however unwillingly, in a system that would destroy his family. Escape became the only way to assert agency as a husband and potential father. Unlike impulsive escape attempts that relied on speed or secrecy, William approached the idea methodically. His years as a craftsman had trained him to think in terms of structure and function. He examined slavery as a system, asking where it was rigid and where it was vulnerable. He observed that surveillance focused heavily on enslaved people who behaved unexpectedly, traveled alone, or moved at night. Conversely, white men traveling with enslaved servants attracted little attention. William's insight was rooted in observation, not fantasy. He had watched white men pass freely through public spaces, negotiate with officials, and command obedience without explanation. He had also observed how enslaved men were rendered socially invisible when positioned correctly. A submissive black servant accompanying a white master was not suspicious, it was expected. This expectation created an opening. The plan that emerged was dangerous precisely because it relied on visibility rather than concealment. Ellen's disguise as a white male invalid would draw authority and trust. William's role as her enslaved servant would validate her identity in the eyes of white society. William recognized that his performance would be as critical as Ellen's. Any deviation, any hint of equality, familiarity, or confidence could expose them instantly. This requirement placed William in an agonizing position. To succeed, he would have to enact the very submission that slavery demanded. even while knowing that the escape depended on his intelligence and planning. He would have to suppress protective instincts toward Ellen, allow her to command him publicly, and accept the risk of punishment if anything went wrong. This inversion of their private relationship was emotionally taxing, but William accepted it as necessary. William also understood that his role carried unique dangers. If Ellen were suspected, she might be questioned. If William were suspected, he could be beaten, detained, or killed immediately. Enslaved men were often treated as inherently threatening, especially if they appeared intelligent or assertive. William would have to appear compliant without seeming suspiciously passive. Preparation became a form of resistance. William and Ellen rehearsed their roles carefully. William coached Ellen on how white men behaved, how they walked, gestured, and interacted with others. These details were not trivial. Slavery relied on performance, and William knew that convincing performance required mastery of social cues. William also helped develop strategies to address Ellen's illiteracy, which posed a significant risk. Travel required paperwork, signatures, and interaction with officials. William supported the plan to feign illness and injury, allowing Ellen to avoid writing and limit speech. This solution reflected William's practical mindset. Problems were not obstacles. They were design challenges. As the plan took shape, William confronted the reality of failure. Capture would not simply return them to enslavement. It could mean separation, sail deeper into the South, or death. William weighed these risks against the certainty of lifelong bondage. The calculation was grim but clear. Staying meant guaranteed loss. Escape, however dangerous, offered possibility. What distinguishes William Craft's role in this story is not physical daring, but intellectual courage. He trusted his understanding of the system more than the fear it was designed to instill. He recognized that slavery's power depended on obedience to its categories and rituals. By performing those rituals convincingly, he believed they could pass through the system unnoticed. This belief was not naive. It was grounded in years of observation and restraint. William had survived slavery not by defiance, but by learning how it worked. Escape would require him to apply that knowledge under extreme pressure. When William and Ellen committed to the plan, they did so knowing that there would be no margin for error. Every interaction, every gesture, and every moment of silence would matter. The escape would not succeed because slavery was blind. It would succeed because slavery trusted itself too much. William Craft entered the escape not as a follower, but as a strategist. His willingness to play a role that appeared submissive while exercising control over the plan reflects a deeper truth about resistance. Power does not always announce itself. Sometimes it hides in discipline, patience, and the refusal to accept the limits imposed by others. By the time December 1848 arrived, William was prepared to become invisible in plain sight. His masculinity, denied by slavery, would reassert itself not through force, but through decision-making and protection. The journey ahead would test whether intelligence could outmaneuver violence. The most dangerous role. Invisible in plain sight. When the escape finally began in December 1848, William Craft understood that his role would be the most psychologically dangerous part of the plan. Ellen's disguise as a white man carried obvious risks, but William knew that suspicion in slave society often fell first on black men. If anything went wrong, it would not be Ellen who would be questioned aggressively or punished immediately. It would be him. His survival depended on convincing white observers that he was exactly what they expected an enslaved man to be. Obedient, silent, deferential, and forgettable. From the moment they stepped into public view, William had to suppress every instinct that slavery had tried to crush, and every instinct that escape demanded. He could not act anxious, because fear drew attention. He could not act confident, because confidence in an enslaved man was considered threatening. He had to inhabit a narrow space between submission and suspicion, performing obedience so naturally that no one would look at him twice. The first leg of the journey required purchasing train tickets in Georgia, a process that immediately exposed them to white officials accustomed to controlling the movement of black bodies. William positioned himself slightly behind Ellen, eyes lowered, posture restrained. This was not accidental. Slave society read posture as character. Any sign of independence could provoke questioning. William knew that appearing too alert or too nervous could be interpreted as guilt. As Ellen interacted with ticket agents, William listened carefully, ready to intervene only if absolutely necessary. He had helped plan Ellen's illness and bandaged arm precisely so that she would not be asked to write or speak extensively. If an official directed a question toward William, he responded briefly and respectfully, never elaborating, never volunteering information. His goal was to disappear into the role. Once on the train, William faced a different challenge. He was surrounded by slaveholders, some of whom traveled with enslaved people of their own. This created a dangerous familiarity. White passengers might speak casually about slavery, business, or politics, assuming William could not understand or would not react. He heard men discuss buying and selling human beings as if they were commodities. He listened to jokes, complaints, and casual cruelty, all while maintaining a neutral expression. At several points, white passengers addressed William directly, issuing minor commands or asking routine questions. Each interaction required careful calibration. William had to answer clearly enough to appear competent, but not so clearly that he seemed educated or assertive. He had to perform ignorance without appearing slow. This balance demanded constant attention. The most dangerous moments came when white men attempted to engage Ellen in conversation and then looked to William for confirmation or clarification. In these moments, William's responses carried enormous weight. A wrong tone, a misplaced glance, or a sign of familiarity could expose the entire deception. William kept his answers brief and indirect, reinforcing Ellen's authority without asserting his own presence. Travel by steamboat intensified these risks. Steamboats were spaces where enslaved labor was visible and normalized. Enslaved people loaded cargo, served passengers, and were transported for sale. William blended into this environment, becoming part of the expected background. Yet this invisibility was precarious. Steamboat crews were accustomed to asserting dominance over enslaved men, sometimes violently. William remained alert, anticipating commands and complying immediately to avoid drawing attention. At one point during the journey, a white passenger who knew Ellen's enslaver from Georgia began conversing with Ellen. William recognized the danger instantly. Familiarity could unravel everything. He positioned himself carefully, ready to redirect attention or respond if addressed. The conversation passed without exposure, but the encounter left William shaken. He understood that knowledge, not suspicion, was the greatest threat. The closer white people came to recognizing Ellen, the more likely the deception would collapse. Throughout the journey, William also had to manage his relationship with Ellen publicly. In private, they were equals, partners, and co-architects of the escape. In public, William had to accept commands, wait silently, and appear emotionally detached. He could not show concern for Ellen's well-being or offer unsolicited assistance. Any sign of intimacy would violate expectations and raise suspicion. This emotional restraint was not a performance William could abandon when tired. It had to be maintained continuously, even when exhaustion set in. William understood that the escape was not a single dramatic moment, but a sustained test of discipline. Each hour increased the risk of error. Fatigue could lead to mistakes. Mistakes could be fatal. Hotel stays posed particular challenges. Registration, luggage handling, and interactions with staff all required precise role-playing. William carried bags, stood aside during conversations, and followed Ellen closely without appearing attentive. He had to anticipate Ellen's needs without acting familiar. This required a shared understanding developed through planning and rehearsal. Their success depended on silent coordination. In free states, the danger did not disappear. William knew that fugitive slave laws allowed for capture even outside the South. Northern officials were often hostile or indifferent, and slave catchers operated openly. Ellen's disguise continued to provide protection, but William remained vulnerable. A black man traveling with a white master could still be detained, questioned, or punished if suspicions arose. The psychological toll of the journey weighed heavily on William. He had to endure moments when white men spoke to Ellen with respect, while ignoring him entirely. He had to witness the ease with which whiteness commanded space and authority. These experiences reinforced his understanding of the system he was escaping. Slavery was not sustained only by violence, but by everyday practices that normalized inequality. When they finally crossed into Pennsylvania and reached Philadelphia, the immediate danger lessened but did not disappear. William remained cautious even among abolitionists. Years of living under surveillance had taught him that safety could be temporary, and trust could be dangerous. Only after Ellen and William revealed their identities to trusted allies did William allow himself to acknowledge what they had achieved. William's role in the escape remained largely invisible to the outside world. Audiences were fascinated by Ellen's disguise, but William knew that the escape would have failed without his discipline, restraint, and strategic thinking. His success lay in understanding that power often depends on those who appear powerless. Behaving exactly as expected. The escape did not end William's struggle. It transformed it. He had moved from being property under the law to being a fugitive under threat. Freedom, he learned, was not a moment, but a condition that had to be defended. His experience during the escape confirmed a lesson he would carry for the rest of his life. Survival under oppression requires intelligence as much as courage. William Craft's journey through slavery was not marked by dramatic confrontation, but by sustained resistance through understanding. His ability to disappear into plain sight revealed the fragility of a system that depended on appearances. The escape was a victory, but it was also a revelation, one that exposed how easily the rituals of slavery could be turned against themselves. Freedom was a target on his back. When William Craft arrived in the North, he understood almost immediately that escape had not brought safety. It had brought visibility. The same intelligence and discipline that had allowed him to pass unnoticed through the South now made him valuable to the abolitionist movement and dangerous to slaveholders. Freedom, he realized, came with a price: being hunted. In cities like Philadelphia and Boston, William and Ellen were welcomed by abolitionist communities who recognized the power of their story. Their escape was not merely inspirational, it was instructional. It demonstrated that slavery was vulnerable to strategy and that enslaved people were capable of complex planning. William's role, though less publicly discussed than Ellen's disguise, was increasingly understood by abolitionists as essential. He had navigated the most dangerous position in the escape, being a black man in plain sight, and survived. Public interest in the Crafts grew rapidly. Newspapers reported on their journey. Abolitionist meetings invited them to speak, and reformers urged them to share their experiences widely. William supported this work, but he remained cautious. He understood that attention could be lethal. Slave catchers followed abolitionist news closely, and the Crafts' fame made them valuable targets. Their former enslavers in Georgia were aware of their whereabouts and were actively seeking their return. William's fears intensified in 1850 with the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act. This law transformed every free state into hunting ground. It authorized federal officials to capture escaped enslaved people, denied accused fugitives the right to testify, and punished anyone who assisted them. For William, the law confirmed what he already knew. Freedom in America was conditional, especially for black men. The danger was immediate and specific. Armed slave catchers traveled north with warrants, and local authorities were often willing to cooperate. In Boston, rumors circulated that the Crafts were being actively pursued. William knew that if captured, he would not be treated as Ellen might be. As a black man perceived as capable and intelligent, he faced the risk of brutal punishment or sale deeper into the South as an example to others. Abolitionist networks responded quickly. Meetings were held, plans were discussed, and defenses were organized. Some abolitionists were prepared to use force to protect fugitives, believing that compliance with the law was morally indefensible. William found himself at the center of this tension. His life became a test case for whether Northern communities would resist federal authority in defense of justice. For William, this period was marked by constant movement and vigilance. He avoided predictable routines, stayed in safe houses, and limited public appearances. He learned to live with uncertainty, knowing that safety depended on secrecy and solidarity. This existence was exhausting, but William refused to surrender to fear. He had not endured slavery to retreat now. Despite the risks, William continued to support abolitionist efforts. He understood that silence would not bring safety. The Fugitive Slave Act was not just a personal threat. It was an assertion that slavery's reach extended everywhere. Resisting it required public confrontation. William's very presence in the North challenged the law's legitimacy. Yet the pressure became overwhelming. Abolitionist leaders recognized that the Crafts' lives were in immediate danger, and that no amount of vigilance could guarantee their protection indefinitely. The same conclusion that Ellen and William would later reach together began to take shape. Remaining in the United States was becoming untenable. The decision to leave the country was painful. William had escaped slavery with the hope of building a life in America. Exile felt like a concession, an admission that the nation was unwilling to protect those it claimed to have freed, but survival required pragmatism. Britain, where slavery had been abolished and public opinion favored abolition, offered safety that America could not. In choosing exile, William demonstrated a different form of courage, leaving men abandoning familiar communities and accepting uncertainty in a foreign land. But it also meant refusing to submit to a law that treated him as property. William understood that resistance sometimes required withdrawal, not defeat, but strategic survival. As William prepared to leave the United States, he reflected on what freedom had meant thus far. Escape had liberated his body, but the law still sought to reclaim it. True freedom, he realized, would require distance from the reach of American slavery. Exile was not the end of his struggle. It was its continuation under new conditions. William Craft left the United States not as a fugitive in hiding, but as a man who had forced the nation to reveal its contradictions. His departure exposed the hollowness of freedom promised without protection. The journey ahead to England would offer safety, but it would also challenge William to redefine resistance beyond escape. Exile, dignity, and learning to love without chains. William Craft's arrival in England marked the first time in his life that his freedom did not require disguise, silence, or constant vigilance. Britain was not free of racism, but it was free of the legal machinery that had defined William as property. For the first time, he could walk through public spaces without fear of being seized, questioned, or forced to prove his right to exist. This change was not merely legal, it was psychological. Freedom, William discovered, was something the body had to learn. British abolitionists welcomed William and Ellen with a level of respect that contrasted sharply with their experiences in the United States. They were invited into homes, lecture halls, and reform circles, not as curiosities, but as moral witnesses. William noticed immediately how differently he was treated. He was addressed directly, listened to attentively, and assumed to be capable of reason and insight. These interactions revealed how much of slavery's violence lay not only in physical control, but in constant dismissal. Life in England also offered William something slavery had systematically denied him: time to reflect. Without the immediate pressure of survival, he could examine the meaning of what he had endured. He began to understand that slavery had trained him to measure himself through others' expectations. Exile provided distance from that training. William was no longer performing submission for safety. He was reclaiming his identity as a thinker and a man. Education played a crucial role in this transformation. Although William had developed practical intelligence and strategic insight under slavery, formal education had been largely inaccessible. In England, he pursued learning with determination. Literacy expanded his ability to articulate experiences that had previously been managed through silence and restraint. Writing became a tool for reclaiming narrative control. Together with Ellen, William participated in abolitionist lectures across Britain. Their presentations differed subtly from those given in the United States. British audiences were less defensive and more receptive to moral critique. William spoke not only about escape, but about the everyday operations of slavery, how it disciplined men, fractured families, and distorted masculinity. He emphasized that slavery sought to destroy enslaved men's ability to act as moral agents, not merely to extract labor. These lectures served a dual purpose. They sustained international pressure against American slavery, and they allowed William to redefine himself publicly. He was no longer invisible. He was no longer required to play a role designed by others. Speaking openly about slavery became an extension of resistance rather than a source of danger. In 1860, William and Ellen published Running 1,000 Miles for Freedom. The book was more than a record of their escape. It was an assertion of intellectual authority. William's voice within the narrative challenged stereotypes that portrayed enslaved men as passive or impulsive. The book revealed careful planning, emotional restraint, and strategic thinking. It presented escape not as luck, but as design. Writing the book also forced William to revisit painful memories. Describing slavery required confronting its psychological violence, the constant humiliation, the denial of family stability, and the suppression of ambition. Yet William understood the necessity of this work. Memory, he believed, was a form of resistance, forgetting allowed injustice to repeat itself. The outbreak of the American Civil War transformed William's understanding of his relationship to the United States. From England, he followed events closely, recognizing the war as the inevitable outcome of a system that had refused reform. The conflict validated abolitionist warnings that slavery was incompatible with democracy. For William, the war was both vindication and tragedy. It confirmed the moral bankruptcy of slavery, but it also represented the cost of delayed justice. When slavery was formally abolished in the United States, William faced a decision similar to the one he had faced earlier, whether to return. Exile had provided safety and dignity, but it had also distanced him from the communities most affected by the aftermath of slavery. Returning meant risk, but it also meant opportunity to participate in rebuilding a society that had once denied his humanity. William chose to return during the Reconstruction era, believing that freedom required active engagement. The post-war South was volatile, marked by both hope and violent resistance. William understood that abolition alone did not dismantle the structures that had sustained slavery. Economic exploitation, political exclusion, and racial terror remained powerful forces. In returning, William did not seek prominence or comfort. He sought purpose. He believed that education was essential to securing freedom for future generations. Alongside Ellen, he supported efforts to educate formerly enslaved people, recognizing literacy as both protection and empowerment. Teaching was not simply charitable work. It was a continuation of resistance. William's experiences in England had reshaped his understanding of dignity. He had learned what it meant to be treated as fully human, and he carried that expectation with him. This expectation clashed sharply with the realities of post-war America, where black men were increasingly targeted as threats to social order. Violence against black educators and leaders was common. William knew the risks, but he also knew the cost of retreat. Exile had taught William that freedom was not a static condition. It was shaped by context, law, and collective action. England had provided safety because it had chosen to abolish slavery decisively. The United States, by contrast, remained ambivalent. William's return exposed the fragility of freedom when it was not backed by sustained commitment. As William navigated this new phase of life, he carried forward the lessons of his escape. Strategy mattered. Patience mattered. Understanding power mattered. Resistance was not always dramatic, but it was always deliberate. William had survived slavery by learning its rules. He now sought to help others survive freedom by teaching them how to navigate a world still shaped by those same rules. Returning to a freedom that did not want him, William Craft returned to the United States during Reconstruction with clarity rather than illusion. He did not believe that the end of slavery meant the end of danger. Years in England had taught him something essential. Freedom without protection is fragile. As he stepped back onto American soil, William understood that the country had changed legally but not psychologically. Slavery was gone, but the fear of black autonomy remained. Reconstruction promised citizenship, education, and political participation for formerly enslaved people. For William, these promises were not abstract. They were urgent necessities. He had seen what happened when freedom was declared without infrastructure. Without education, land, and legal protection, freedom could be reversed in practice, even if it survived on paper. William and Ellen returned with a specific mission: education. They believed that literacy was the strongest defense against re-enslavement in new forms. Teaching black children and adults to read, write, and think critically was not simply about opportunity. It was about survival. An uneducated population could be exploited, misled, and stripped of rights with ease. The environment they returned to was hostile. White resistance to Reconstruction was violent and organized. Former Confederates regained local power quickly. Black schools were targeted. Teachers were threatened, assaulted, and sometimes killed. William knew this history was repeating itself because the underlying fear had never disappeared. Educated black men challenged the hierarchy slavery had built. William's presence alone made him a target. He was literate, articulate, and known for his escape. He represented everything white supremacist groups feared. Unlike during slavery, violence was no longer officially sanctioned, but it was often ignored or excused. William had to navigate this landscape with the same strategic awareness that had once carried him through the South as a fugitive. Education work required patience. Resources were scarce. Buildings were often improvised. Supplies were minimal, yet attendance was high. Formerly enslaved people understood instinctively what education represented. William observed students who had worked from childhood, sitting for hours to learn letters they had once been beaten for trying to recognize. Teaching also forced William to confront the emotional aftermath of slavery. Many students carried trauma, distrust, and fear. William did not approach them as a distant authority. He understood their experiences because he had lived them. His authority came not from position, but from shared survival. As Reconstruction weakened, the threats intensified. Laws were rewritten to limit black political participation. Economic systems like sharecropping replaced slavery with debt dependency. Violence increased as white supremacist groups sought to restore dominance through terror. William recognized these patterns immediately. They were slavery by another name. What distinguished William during this period was his refusal to romanticize progress. He did not mistake legal change for moral transformation. He had seen how quickly freedom could be undermined when society refused to enforce it. His speeches and writings during this time emphasized vigilance. Freedom, he argued, required constant defense. William's masculinity, once denied by slavery, was now contested by a society unwilling to accept black male authority. Educated black men were portrayed as dangerous, arrogant, or illegitimate. William countered this narrative not through confrontation, but through presence. He taught, organized, and lived visibly as a man who refused to accept imposed inferiority. This visibility came at a cost. As Reconstruction collapsed, support networks weakened. Federal protection diminished. William and Ellen faced increasing hostility. The dream of a transformed South was fading. William understood that the same forces that had driven them into exile before were reasserting themselves. Yet William did not view this period as failure. He understood history as cyclical rather than linear. Progress advanced, retreated, and advanced again. His role was not to guarantee outcomes, but to contribute to continuity. Education planted seeds that could survive even when institutions failed. William's return to America exposed a painful truth. Escape had freed his body. Exile had restored his dignity, but America still struggled to accept his humanity. This realization did not break him. It sharpened his understanding of resistance. True freedom was not about belonging to a nation, but about refusing to internalize its injustices. As William aged, his public visibility decreased, but his influence remained. Students he taught carried his lessons forward. His writings preserved testimony that could not be erased. His life became evidence that intelligence, strategy, and discipline could survive even the most dehumanizing systems. William Craft did not expect gratitude from history. He understood that societies often forget those who expose their contradictions. What mattered to him was continuity, ensuring that knowledge survived even when power resisted it. The man history swept over. As the story of the Craft's escape entered public memory, something subtle but consequential began to happen. The narrative narrowed. Attention gravitated toward the spectacle of disguise, toward Ellen Craft's transformation into a white male traveler. That aspect of the escape was undeniably dramatic. But in emphasizing it, history began to sideline the man whose discipline, restraint, and strategic intelligence made the journey possible. In this process, William Craft slowly faded into the background of his own life story. This erasure was not accidental. It reflected deeper patterns in how history has been written and remembered. Stories of resistance are often shaped by what audiences find visually striking or symbolically convenient. Ellen's disguise challenged race and gender in a way that was immediately legible and shocking. William's role, by contrast, required understanding power, psychology, and performance. It was quieter, less theatrical, and therefore easier to overlook. Gender bias played a central role in this imbalance. Abolitionist audiences, particularly in the 19th century, were often more comfortable celebrating women's suffering than men's strategic agency. Ellen could be framed as vulnerable, courageous, and exceptional without threatening prevailing ideas about male authority. William, however, complicated those ideas. He was an enslaved man who demonstrated foresight, leadership, and emotional control qualities white society associated with itself. Acknowledging his role meant acknowledging that slavery failed to suppress black male intellect. There was also a tendency to misinterpret William's restraint as passivity. Because he survived by appearing submissive, later observers sometimes confused performance with personality. This misunderstanding ignored the reality that William's survival depended on suppressing visible assertion, not lacking it. His escape required him to master obedience as a disguise. just as Ellen mastered whiteness and masculinity as tools. Both were performances, and both were acts of resistance. Even within abolitionist circles, narratives often emphasized individual heroism over collective strategy. The escape was frequently retold as a daring gamble rather than a carefully engineered operation. This framing minimized William's planning role and reinforced the myth that enslaved people escaped through luck or impulse rather than intellect. Such myths made slavery seem less cruel and resistance seem less threatening. William's later life also contributed to his marginalization in historical memory. Unlike some abolitionists who sought public recognition, William did not cultivate celebrity. He focused on education, writing, and community work efforts that rarely produced dramatic headlines. His refusal to center himself publicly meant that later generations had fewer simplified stories to tell about him. Race further shaped this erasure. As the United States entered the Jim Crow era, historical narratives increasingly minimized black male leadership. Acknowledging William Craft as a strategist conflicted with ideologies that portrayed black men as dependent, dangerous, or incapable of self-direction. Forgetting William was easier than confronting the implications of his competence. The imbalance in memory also reflects how masculinity under slavery has been misunderstood. Enslaved men were often portrayed either as brute laborers or as broken figures stripped of agency. William's life contradicts both stereotypes. He was neither powerless nor reckless. He was deliberate, adaptive, and deeply analytical. His masculinity was not erased by slavery. It was constrained, redirected, and expressed through strategy. Recovering William Craft's role forces a reassessment of how resistance is defined. Resistance does not always announce itself through rebellion or violence. Sometimes it appears as patience, silence, and calculation. William resisted by understanding the system so completely that he could move through it without triggering its defenses. This form of resistance is harder to celebrate because it exposes how fragile, unjust systems truly are. Modern scholarship has begun to correct this imbalance, emphasizing that the Crafts' escape was a partnership. Ellen's disguise and William's performance were inseparable. Each depended on the other. The success of the journey lay not in individual brilliance alone, but in coordination, trust, and shared risk. William's role was not secondary. It was structurally essential. Remembering William Craft accurately also changes how we understand freedom narratives more broadly. It reminds us that enslaved men were not merely reacting to oppression, but actively analyzing it. They were thinkers operating under extreme constraint. William's life demonstrates that intellectual resistance existed even when it could not be openly expressed. As history re-examines the past, William Craft's story challenges audiences to look beyond spectacle and ask deeper questions. Who planned? Who calculated risk? Who bore the greatest danger? In the Craft's escape, the answers complicate comfortable assumptions. William Craft did not disappear because he lacked significance. He was stepped over because his significance disrupted too many myths. Restoring him to the center of his story is not an act of generosity. It is an act of accuracy. What his life reveals about power, freedom, and memory. By the time William Craft reached the final years of his life, he had lived through slavery, escape, exile, war, emancipation, and the slow betrayal of Reconstruction. Few individuals experience such a complete arc of American history from the position of someone once legally defined as property. Yet William did not frame his life as a series of triumphs. He understood it as a continuous struggle against systems that adapted rather than disappeared. What William Craft's life ultimately reveals is that slavery was never sustained solely by chains or laws. It was sustained by belief in racial hierarchy, belief in male authority defined by whiteness, belief that intelligence and leadership belonged to some people and not others. William's escape, activism, and survival exposed how fragile those beliefs were when confronted by someone who understood them deeply. William did not challenge slavery by denying its power. He acknowledged it fully. He recognized its violence, its surveillance, and its psychological control. What made his resistance effective was that he did not underestimate the system he opposed. He studied it. He observed how authority moved, how suspicion operated, and how obedience was performed. His escape was not a rejection of reality. It was a precise engagement with it. This clarity carried into his understanding of freedom. William never believed that freedom was a destination reached once and secured forever. His experiences taught him that freedom could exist legally and still be undermined socially, economically, and violently. The Fugitive Slave Act showed him how quickly freedom could be revoked. Reconstruction showed him how easily it could be hollowed out. Jim Crow demonstrated how oppression could be reborn without chains. William's legacy, therefore, is not simply that he escaped slavery. It is that he refused to accept shallow definitions of liberation. He understood that true freedom required education, memory, and collective vigilance. This is why teaching mattered so much to him. Literacy was not just knowledge, it was defense. It allowed people to recognize contracts designed to exploit them, laws written to exclude them, and narratives meant to erase them. His life also forces a reconsideration of masculinity under oppression. Slavery attempted to strip enslaved men of authority, autonomy, and responsibility. William resisted this, not by violence, but by decision-making. He protected his family through strategy. He asserted his manhood through planning, restraint, and sacrifice. His masculinity was not performative dominance, it was accountability. In historical memory, William Craft has often been reduced to a supporting role. This reduction mirrors the very dynamic slavery enforced crediting whiteness and spectacle while minimizing black male intellect. Restoring William to the center of his own story is not about balance for its own sake. It is about accuracy. The escape succeeded because two people understood power from different positions and acted together. William's life also warns against comfort in progress narratives. His story shows that injustice does not always announce its return with chains. It often reappears through bureaucracy, economics, and selective enforcement of law. Systems rarely collapse under moral pressure alone. They adapt unless actively dismantled. For modern audiences, William Craft's life poses uncomfortable questions. How much of today's inequality depends on assumptions that go unexamined? Who is trusted automatically, and who must prove themselves repeatedly? How often is intelligence dismissed because it does not match expectations? William's escape worked because slave society trusted itself too much. It believed it knew what a master looked like and what a slave looked like. It believed obedience meant lack of thought. William used those beliefs as camouflage. That lesson extends beyond slavery. Any system that relies on rigid categories contains the seeds of its own failure. As history continues to be debated, simplified, and politicized, William Craft's life reminds us why memory matters. Forgetting is not neutral. Erasure protects power by obscuring how it is challenged. Remembering William accurately disrupts comforting myths about the past and forces a more honest reckoning with the present. William Craft did not seek to be remembered as a hero. He sought survival, dignity, and continuity. His resistance was not loud, but it was relentless. He survived not by becoming invisible forever, but by choosing when invisibility was a weapon and when visibility was necessary. In the end, William Craft's life teaches a final, enduring truth. Oppression depends on people accepting the roles assigned to them, and freedom begins when those roles are understood well enough to be refused. That understanding carried William Craft from slavery to escape, from exile to education, and from erasure toward recognition. His story does not offer comfort, it offers clarity, and clarity, as William Craft knew, is where real freedom begins.